Hello friends, this is a special presentation of Good News in a World of Chaos, interrupting my four-part series looking at the question, if God is in control, why is there so much evil in the world? So far we looked at rebellion number 1 that transpired in the Garden of Eden. And as I was preparing for rebellion number 2, I realized there were and will be some teaching throughout this series that will be new to even long-term Christians, as it was to me before connecting with Hebrew scholar Dr. Michael Heiser. Here is a brief bio for your information, and I recommend that you check out his books and his podcast. Much of what I will share with you today comes from this material, but there is so much more detail that will help you in your reading, your studying, and your understanding of the Bible. Enjoy. So because of that, I felt led to prepare a special post dealing with important terms and definitions that were and will be addressed in this series. The topics that I'm going to be addressing today in this broadcast include Elohim and Yahweh, sons of God, divine counsel, imagers, the Garden of Eden, and the serpent. So let's begin with two common words for God. First, it is the second most common word in the Old Testament for God, Elohim. You may be aware that in the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. One of the things that I'd like to point out here is that Elohim can be either singular or plural. And there's a verse seen here in Psalm chapter 82, verse 1, that actually confirms that statement. It says, God, Elohim, stands in the divine assembly. He administers judgment in the midst of the gods, Elohim. Now you see that in that first part of that verse, Elohim actually is singular because it is a subject to a singular verb form. The second time that it's used, it's plural. Why? Because the preposition in front of it, in the midst of, requires more than one. You see, you can't be in the midst of one. Therefore, we recognize the singular Elohim of Israel, Yahweh, presides over an assembly of Elohim gods. It's also true that Elohim refers to any inhabitants of the spiritual realm. However, Yahweh possesses superior attributes with respect to all Elohim. So let's take a moment and look at the most common word in the Bible used for God, Yahweh. One thing that becomes clear in studying the Old Testament is that the writers truly understood that Yahweh was an Elohim, but no other Elohim was Yahweh. He was species unique among all residents of the spiritual world. Speaking of residents of the spiritual world, we need to look at references to sons of God, who are divine beings under the authority of the God of Israel, Yahweh. In Job, we see them mentioned in chapter 1, verse 6, which says, "One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord." And then later on, in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "On another day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord." And then later on, we read how they were with God at creation. In God's questioning of Job, he says, "And all the angels, or sons of God, shouted for joy." Let me be clear. God has a spiritual family, and in the Bible, they are referred to as sons of God and angels. Now let's look at another term divine council or assembly. This council is made up of God, Yahweh, and the sons of God and angels in an assembly in the heavens. It is an assembly, as I said, in the heavens, not on earth. Now I provided 2 verses of scripture that reinforce this statement. Psalm chapter 89, verse 6 and 7. It says, "For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings, or sons of God? In the council of the holy ones, or sons of God, God is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him." This council is described as surrounding God. This council is said to be made up of holy ones, another term used to describe the heavenly hosts, sons of God and angels. We will see them again when we move along to talk about the Garden of Eden. Now we'll take a moment and look at the term image. And we see it found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God refers to making man in our image, in our likeness, he says. You see, we are created to image God, to be his imagers. It is what we are by definition. The image is not an ability that we have, but a status. We are God's representatives on earth. The us in this verse 26 reminds us that as we are to carry out his will in this realm, those included in the us were also created to function as his administrators in the unseen realm. They are also like him. To be human is to be an imager of God. And as verse 28 in Genesis chapter 1 says, we are to create more imagers in order to oversee the earth by stewarding its resources and harnessing them for the benefit of all human imagers. It says we're to subdue and rule over. In the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, it says that Christ is the ultimate image of God. It says the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Now we're going to move along to important insight into the Garden of Eden. God's plan was to have an earthly family who would live with his spiritual family. Eden was God's earthly home. It was the place he planted the tree of life, the place where there was to be no death. We see that he dwelt with Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. It says he walked in the garden in the cool of the day. We see also in verse 22 that his spiritual family were also with him there. Listen to what it says. The man has now become like one of us, sons of God, knowing good and evil. Just imagine what our world would have been like if rebellion number 1 hadn't happened. It would have been transformed into a global Eden. There would have been no death. There would have been everlasting life on a perfected planet. It would have been living and being with God and his spiritual family forever. There is good news, and it's found in the end of the story. We hear in Revelation chapter 22, verses 2 and 3, on each side of the river stood the tree of life. No longer will there be any curse. You see, people will not be barred from eating from the tree of life. Isn't that exciting? We also look at the term serpent or Nakash. It's important to recognize that the tempter to Eve was not someone or something who frightened her, like a talking snake would most certainly have done. He was someone that she was familiar with, someone that was a part of the garden along with God and the other spiritual beings. The problem was he was a rebel, a divine being who wanted to be God, who opposed God's choices for his human imagers. This began as a supernatural rebellion. It's interesting to note that this villain was cast down to the earth, the realm of the dead, where he became Lord of the dead, where death now reigned, away from God and the divine council. He became our arch enemy. And lastly, I'd just like to point out a term called the Second Temple period. During that time, between the building of the Second Temple and its destruction in 70 AD, the New Testament writers were inspired and were influenced in their writings by books not included in Scripture. But they were certainly a part of their intellectual worldview. Recognizing this will enable us to understand the supernatural outlook they took in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 to 4, and the flood. We will see some of this background play out in our next post, Rebellion number 2. You will note that on Wednesday of this week, I'll be uploading this post. I hope to see you there. Be encouraged. There is good news, even as we see rebellion play out. God bless and stay well. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Good news in a world of chaos.